Welcome to the Smart Business Revolution.
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 You want a revolution?
You say you want a revolution?
Revolution. The revolution.
It's going on right now.
Welcome to The Revolution, the Smart Business Revolution podcast, where we ask today's most successful entrepreneurs to share the tools and strategies they use to build relationships and connections to grow their revenue. Now, your host for The Revolution, John Corcoran.
All right, welcome everyone. John Corcoran here, the host of this show. And if you are new to listening to this program, check out our archives because we've got all kinds of great interviews with intelligent CEOs, founders, and entrepreneurs of companies and organizations ranging from Netflix to Kinko's, YPO, EO, Activation Blizzard. Just did Quicken the other day, co-founder of Redfin. All kinds of great interviews there. So check those out. I'm also the co-founder of Rise 25, where we help connect B2B business owners to their ideal prospects. And my guest here today is Avi Staiman. He is the founder and CEO of Academic Language Experts. It's a company that assists academic scholars to prepare their research for publication and to give it attention that it deserves in the world. He's also the co-host of the New Books Network Scholarly Communication podcast. He's been a guest lecturer at NYU in their master's program in translation and interpreting, and also at the University of Tokyo and Bar-Ilan University, and his essays have appeared in the Cambridge University Press blog, Scholarly Kitchen, Multilingual, and Times Higher Education. And of course, this episode is brought to you by Rise 25, where we help B2B businesses to get clients, referrals, and strategic partnerships with Done For You podcasts and content marketing. And if you're listening to this and you're curious about doing a podcast like Avi and I have done, go to rise25.com and you can learn all about how to do it. All right. It's so great to have you here. And I want to dive straight into your story. First of all, you're an entrepreneur now, but you studied to be a teacher. And there must have been something that happened along that path there. How does one go into you're going to dedicate your life to being in a classroom and deciding I'm going to go down this entrepreneurial path? That's an unusual one. You don't hear about that every day.
Yeah. So first of all, John, thanks so much for having me on. It's a real pleasure. I love what you're doing with the podcast and, the opportunity to speak today. So yeah, it's funny because sometimes when I listen to, founder stories and hear about some of the founders who kind of were born with this entrepreneurial bug and kind of always knew that they were going to do something and tinkered in their parents' garage from the age of 7, I can't always relate. I like to say that I sort of fell into entrepreneurship more than I chose entrepreneurship. I was always creative as a kid. I liked doing things that were out of the box, but I never thought of myself as sort of someone who's going to, take on an industry or disrupt and innovate in a crazy way. I sort of saw myself more in the lens of trying to be able to influence positively, the next generation, giving over, values, education, and sort of saw my life going down that path. Now, don't get me wrong. Even till today, I think that many of the sort of, studies and experiences I had in the world of education, as a younger professional influence what I do today. But it kind of, and it may have even laid the pathway, but it definitely is not your typical entrepreneur story.
Yeah, I can totally relate to that because I was an English major. I worked in politics. I was a lawyer. I kind of went down these different career paths. And so I don't feel like I was that kid that was out there, with a hustle. And it's kind of, I admire people like that at times, but also I kind of feel like, God, I wasn't that person. Do I even belong? There's kind of this imposter syndrome stuff that comes up. So what was it then you were in, was it in your university studies that you kind of started to see this opportunity?
Yeah. So I'll tell you a little bit about the story about how this all came about. And it really was started by mistake, to be perfectly honest. When I went down the path to education, I would get many different responses, wavering from, oh, good for you to, you're crazy. You're going to be on the breadline. The one thing that everyone kind of said to me, and this is both teachers as well as, in-laws and, friends, is, well, how are you going to, kind of supplement your income and make sure that you can support your family? And that's, really important. Even though I wasn't yet married at the time, I kind of, assumed that I would have, at some point be shouldering the responsibilities of being a breadwinner. So I said to myself, okay, I need to be, if I do want to be a teacher, and if this is my passion, I need to kind of have something to back me up, something to do on the side. Around the same time I was finishing up my bachelor's degree, I was studying in Israel, where I live until today. And half out of laziness, half out of, I basically asked my lecturer, would you mind if I write my papers in English as opposed to writing in Hebrew? I was still kind of a new immigrant, and, I knew it would take me about a tenth of the time. He kindly agreed. No academic can admit that they don't know English. So, they kind of have to agree. And I did. And he was impressed with my writing, just in my papers that I had written. And I don't know whether that was deservedly so or not, but he was impressed with what I wrote and said to me, you know what, Avi, I've got this article in Hebrew that I wrote. I'd really love to get it published in a journal. What do you say? You want to give it a crack for trying to translate it and help me, kind of get it out there? And that's sort of the currency for those who aren't familiar in the academic world. Your currency is, how often you publish and where you publish, right? It's the adage is publish or perish, right? You always have to kind of be getting your work out there, getting your name out there as often as possible. So I said, what the hell, how hard could it be? Little did I know it would take me 4 months to finish, and it's really hard. It is not simple, especially when it's topics that you're not previously familiar with, because kind of each academic branch is its own world and its own language and its own jargon. But I took it on and I did it. And I said to myself, on the one hand, wow, that was really hard. On the other hand, I can kind of do this from wherever, right? I don't necessarily need to be sitting in an office, which was really important to me, because if I wanted to teach, I didn't want to have to then commute to a second, job. So I was like, okay. And I realized that there's a need here, right? I started hearing from other of my lecturers and asking them, and they're like, oh yeah, I really need help to get my article into shape before I send it off. So I realized there was this kind of gap in the market. So slowly but surely, I was basically teaching during the day. I would teach from 9 to 2 or 3. And as soon as the school day was out, I would just kind of hit the computer and I would open up my laptop and I would start, hustling and start cold emailing my own professors and being like, hey, this is what I'm doing. You interested? I mean, I look back at my emails today and I cringe at what I wrote, but hey, I was hustling. I was hanging out a shingle and I was doing my thing. So most of them would ignore me or write back who are you, kid? Scram. But there were a few who kind of took a chance, worked with me. I had plenty of screw ups in the beginning and learned a lot of lessons quite quickly. But what happened was, after a pretty short amount of time, I realized it dawned on me. I really didn't love the teaching. It was 36 kids, two kids to a desk, a lot of discipline. And I kind of was looking forward to when the day was over and I got to hit my laptop to work on this side project. And at a certain point, I kind of realized, well, you know what? If I'm really suffering as a teacher and I'm loving this other thing, maybe I should kind of, give this other thing a go and see where it takes me. And that's kind of how this business, started.
And was it generating enough money at that point that you could set aside teaching and move full time to it?
That's a really good question. The answer in hindsight was probably no. At the time, we were kind of it was, I was newly married. So it was me and my wife. Full credit to her. I think she was bringing in a bigger salary than I was. So that kind of helped to just make sure that we had a roof to put over our heads, food, to put on the table. So that gave me a little bit of leeway to kind of experiment and play around with this. Also in the beginning, kind of I imagine that a lot of your listeners were entrepreneurs that started doing the service themselves and then later on sort of pivoted to becoming a business. So that was kind of how we built it as well. So at the beginning, it was kind of every dime that came in did end up in my pocket. So it was that was enough to kind of get things started. We never took on any outside capital investment till today. It's entirely a bootstrap company, kind of built based on every dollar that we made. I'd take the 5 cents, home to pay for the bills. And then the other 95% would be reinvested in the business, and kind of just grew organically from there. I mean, luckily it's not a business that, at least in the beginning, requires a lot of infrastructure or office building. We're talking about doing remote work, already 10, 15 years ago. That's kind of how the mindset I was in.
And you touched on something I was going to ask you about, which is, and I experienced this when I went out on my own from practicing law to working for myself. I found, oh, wow, I can charge a lot for this and it doesn't cost me a lot and it's almost all profit. But the challenge is then you realize, oh, okay, if I'm not working, I'm not making money. I can't go on vacation. So then you have to kind of start building up a team and hiring people. But immediately you make less money because you got to pay them, right? So how did you, how did you make that transition into, oh man, I'm not going to make as much money. I'm not generating a lot of revenue as it is, but I'm going to make even less if I give it to someone else to do the work.
Yeah. So I can remember a specific time where that like hit me. I got lucky in that I wasn't great at my job. I know that sounds like ironic, right? But what I mean by that is
doing the translations.
Yeah, I didn't love it. I didn't love doing the translation itself. I loved like everything around it. I loved finding the clients. I loved like building out the systems and the process. The actual sitting down and like doing the work, I didn't love. And I remember one specific project in classics. It was like, about like ancient history and language. And I was sitting there and I felt like not just imposter syndrome. I'm like, I'm an imposter. Like, I do not know this field. I'm not an academic in this field. I'm making it up as I go along. And like, I didn't feel like I was doing justice to the clients. And I also kind of knew, I think in my gut, like people aren't going to use me if they're not happy with the product. And I knew that kind of it wasn't going to be complete. So I kind of took a pause and said to myself, okay, for those projects that I know and that I feel confident with, I'll continue doing those. For those projects that I'm like, I'm not so sure that like I'm really the expert that should be taking this on, or a language set that I wasn't familiar with, So I would start outsourcing, and I would start, the same way I kind of cold emailed the clients. I would start, reaching out to different translators and editors. It really started as a language business. We've evolved since then to do all sorts of research support. But it was kind of like, reaching out to translators and editors that were in my network that I found online, and just kind of asking them, if they were interested in taking on projects, I don't know, taking a 15% cut for myself and going from there. We've gotten a lot more sophisticated over the years and things have changed, but the basic premise of how the company is structured, whereby, each project is allocated and, assigned to a specific expert in the field, that actually still continues to be the core USP, the core value that we have until today. So that kind of happened fairly early in the business. True, it did cut into our, kind of like the bottom line. But to be honest, the bottom line wasn't so big anyway. So, it was and I kind of knew that like, if I wanted to grow this, if I wanted it to ever become something that would outlast me, and I had this intuition, like, I realized like I can't call this after, like a lot of people, call their businesses after their own name. I was like, I don't want to do that. Like, I don't want to be, I knew from the beginning, I wanted to build a business that it could exist, without me, and that could exist like with me kind of, being that teacher, going back to the education role, the hat of modeling and education, but not being like the star, centerpiece that everything would have to be dependent on.
Yeah. Now, you offer translation and editing services in English, Hebrew, Spanish, French, Chinese, Russian, Arabic, German, Portuguese. I'm just reading off your LinkedIn list here. And what I want to know is, a lot of times entrepreneurs struggle with this idea of moving beyond what they're capable of doing. So how did you move into these other languages and ensure that you're going to deliver a quality product when I imagine you don't speak all those different languages?
Indeed. That's the first question I ask a lot when I tell people I run a language company, is they say, oh, well, you must speak 1,000 languages. I'm actually, I speak 2. That's it. So I'm not one of these like, European geniuses who like, just can kind of, speak 8 languages. I just want to give a little bit of background for folks who aren't familiar. Basically, the company that I run, Academic Language Experts, and that I founded, what we do is our goal is to help scholars to publish their research. So, for example, I don't know, let's say, take yourself back 2 years in the middle of the pandemic. You're an academic and you think you're a researcher and you think you found the vaccine for corona, like you've got it, right? How does that get out into the world? You can't just like send out a press release like I've got it. What you need to do is you need to take your research, you need to, polish it, make it perfect, and then send it off to a journal. Now, what's going to happen at that journal, what's going to happen at that publisher is they're going to put it through a rigorous peer review process. That's how science works, right? They're going to have like, other scholars come in and attack it from every angle and try to figure out like, what's the problem here? Because we want, we assume as a society that basically facts are what science dictates or tells us. But if that scientific process and method isn't rigorous and we can't trust that process, then like all of a sudden, well, what are facts anymore? Like what is the value of research? So at the beginning, we really were a language company. So we're talking about translation editing, and I'll get back to your question in a minute. But I think what happened is that, I just started trying to listen to what our scholars need. And what I realized is the language services were a vehicle towards an end. And the end goal was them getting their science out to the world, them being able to communicate in an effective and quick and cost-effective way what they were trying, which really is like their passion, their baby. I mean, researchers can work for 5-10 years to solve a specific problem or to do a study, that has an impact on the world. So we were developing a suite of services to kind of help those researchers through that process. Now, one of the major services that we offer and that we've always offered is translation. And that gets back to your question. So the answer is that essentially we have a team on our team internally. I mean, we don't have a very large team, but we speak 7 different languages between us now. So that's one way of doing some of the quality control. Number 2 is that, we built out a really loyal and dedicated team of freelancers around the world that we work with very continuously. So when we do have a language set that falls outside of, our normal sort of internal review process, we will outsource and do a secondary review by one of our freelancers. We'll get people to check each other. We vet quite vigorously when it comes to who's working for us. So we're taking 1 in every 25 to 30 applicants that apply. And over time, I think those who have a keen ear for language, and you said you're an English major, so I imagine that you probably have this. You can pick up a text and pretty quickly get a feel for, is it written well? So even if I don't know the source language, right? Let's say it's Chinese to English, I can most of the time read the English and say, I feel like there's a translation here. And actually, the way that we define our goal to our staff is people should read it and never have a clue that it was translated in the first place. It should read it smooth, naturally, coherent. You're enjoying the reading experience and process. And I think that's a mistake, that many people, or, the common conception of translation, which is just like, oh, you're moving words from one language to another. But I think we've all seen what Google Translate, how screwed up that can be when that's the concept. And really, we're approaching it from an entirely different viewpoint, one that says, what does good writing look like? And how do we, on the one hand, honor the source text and treat it as authoritative, because we're not here to make up our own shit, right? We're here to like give over what we're supposed to be giving over. But on the other hand, render it in a way which is really beautiful and elegant and literary in the target language. And that's really, I think, the sort of the art form that is high quality translations. There are certain, even though you're right, there are differences between every language, and every language needs its own experts and expertise. There's a sort of common theme and common thread of good writing that I think, kind of goes through that entire process. Right.
I want to ask about, because, I've been in kind of the world of B2B for a long time. Most of the clients I've worked with, even going back to practicing law, were businesses. And so if you get beneath everything, there's ultimately a profit motive. They want to make money. But that's not the case with your clientele. And, maybe they're a graduate student, maybe they're studying for a postdoc, maybe it's a PhD or something like that. A lot of times, I imagine you've got clientele that don't have a lot of discretionary money to throw around. So how have you managed to overcome that? How have you managed to get them to spend money on these services?
It's a really good question. I think it's a keen observation, because most people don't ask that question, but it's actually something that we, kind of struggle with. I wouldn't say, maybe struggle is not the right word, but we've contended with throughout the course of the history of the business.
Well, you've managed to build a business in spite of it. So I'm curious what the secret is. Indeed.
And I'll tell you, John, there were times at the beginning where I said to myself, what the hell am I doing? Like, why am I not just building a legal let's stick with the translation. Fine, great. Stick with the editing, but just do it for law firms and do it for, medical, for pharma companies. Like, there's so much more money to be made there. Obviously the competition is also, in line with that, right? It's not like it's, necessarily low hanging fruit. And I think what I realized, there's 2 things, 2 primary things. First of all, is we have had to identify our core clientele, not as the folks you mentioned. So not as the students, not as the doctoral, candidates, not as the postdocs, rather the senior scholars who have funding from their institutions. So most scholars will have a discretionary fund that they can tap into, kind of on an annual basis. They can apply for external funding from from the National Institute of Health in the States, the National Science Foundation. Those are like there's big money there that can be tapped into for researchers. So, that's kind of just identifying our core clientele has been an important part. And there's a trade-off to that. It kills me that I can't help the doctoral students nearly as much as I'd like to, but, oftentimes it's just beyond their means, especially because they're students as well. And number two is really understanding the value of creating a unique niche or a unique business in a niche, which allows you to a certain extent to dictate pricing. So I actually think in an ironic twist, I have more flexibility on pricing now than I ever would have had I gone down the legal and scientific route. Because if you're a lawyer and you're looking for, a law firm from Spanish to English, if Avi, and academic language experts are too expensive, well, you've got 15 other, places in the phone book, or go onto Google reviews that you can kind of, hit up. There might be differences. We might have a higher quality, but it's just so easy to price compare. What we're doing is so unique. And we're not the only company. There is an industry where we're in the industry called author services. So it's basically how to help researchers, publish. There are other players in the market. There aren't many, in my opinion. Not all of them are doing it in a great way. So we kind of have become a little bit unique and built ourselves our own niche so that our reputation kind of enables us to dictate pricing. Now, that's within certain parameters, right? The research budgets aren't endless. But yes, there have been scholars, and especially over Corona, who have said, you know what, I see the value, because essentially what happened, someone once told me, to think about it this way: people will pay as much for a translation, and you can fill in the blank for anything about, really, I think when it comes to business, people will pay as much as they have to lose if it goes wrong. Okay. And I think that's important in law and other fields as well. Meaning, what's on the line? That's really the question, and that's the question I think every business owner has to ask in their clients' minds. What's on the line if this gets totally screwed up and, is a big failure? And if the answer is not much, well, maybe the business value proposition is not actually as valuable as we think it is. So in our case, in the case of research support, what's on the line is so many different things. First of all, it's pride and it's name recognition and status. In the end of the day, scholars, if we're talking about deep needs, they really want to leave a legacy. They care very deeply about the research topic they've chosen. Most of them, this is their life work. They've chosen to dedicate their time, their energy. I kind of sometimes the analogy that I use is it's like they kind of, when they come to us, it's kind of like they're dropping their baby off at childcare and saying, I'm very nervous, but I'm going to trust you with my baby. You better bring it back, tip top, right? There's no, and people get really sensitive about that and really care deeply. On the flip side, when we do a great job, which thankfully we do most of the time, people are very loyal, right? They come back again and again and again because they say, I want my baby to have the best. But we've really kind of been able to, carve out this niche. And because it's unique, we've been able to kind of not have to worry so much about price competition and things of that nature. So what they have to lose if it gets screwed up is basically they don't get published, which means that A, their legacy that they want to leave is not fulfilled. B, that's the currency in the academic world. So they're not getting promoted. I mean, we're talking about promotions are dependent on, frequency and quality of publications, and its reputation, among their colleagues. So a lot is riding on the success. So you have scholars that not only, will tap into their own research funds, but will also pay out of pocket because they realize that it's kind of an investment in themselves and an investment in their careers by getting help from us. So it really has enabled us, what we're charging now, to be honest, is probably more than what most legal translation companies are charging for their work. So that's kind of just to give you a bit of perspective.
Wow. Interesting. How have you figured out what additional services to provide and when it's the right time to go into those other areas as well?
Yeah, really good question. I mean, a lot of it, like I said before, is just listening. It's just what I think what we realized after a few years is we were doing a lot of this language stuff, right? We're doing translation, we're doing editing, and people would come back to us. Our clients would come back to us when they got rejected from a journal and say, what did you do? Why did it get rejected? And we would turn around to them and say, we'd put our hands up and say, well, listen, we're editing your research, but we're not the researchers, right? Like if you put together crap research or you didn't bother, getting, your statistics right, we can't help you with that. But then I realized I was having more and more of these conversations and I said to myself, well, maybe if that's the case, then maybe we shouldn't be pushing, language services. Maybe that's not the solution for everybody. Maybe different scholars need different things. Maybe, we could translate something like Shakespeare. That doesn't mean that it's going to get accepted. So what we started to do is think, okay, well, what are the services that we can build out that really would be helpful? So we've sort of segmented it. So at first we said, well, we've got the junior scholars. They don't know what they're doing in many cases. Their advisors are oftentimes AWOL, and it's a very dog-eat-dog world. So no one's helping them, right? So there's this feeling of isolation and being alone. So we built this service, and it's kind of made up. It's not like I necessarily looked around and was like, ooh, this other business is doing it, so let's copy them. Like, I just made this up from what I realized people need. So, and we as a team really did this. So, for example, the first, so one of the services we developed was an academic coaching service where people could hop on Zoom, hop on the phone, and kind of have an advisor, a coach, to walk them through the process and give them tips, not to do the work for them, but to kind of guide them in the right direction. Then we realized scholars had a really hard time when they wanted to write a book, putting together a strong book proposal, which if you want to publish a book, your proposal needs to be really top notch. You need to be able to define who your audience is. You need to be able to define like, how you're going to sell the book. And the scholars were like totally lost. They're like, if you want me to tell you about, my research, I can, but you wanted me to tell you about like who my target market is? Like, I don't know, that's your job. And it would just be this gap there. So we said, okay, we can fill that gap. This isn't rocket science. Like, we'll help scholars tease out who their, target, market is. And, so little things like that, academic reviews. So someone wants to come with, a scholar works on a project for 4 years. They don't see the blind spots in their research. So having an external consultant come in and say, okay, listen, what you did here was great, but maybe in this section, you need to kind of consider other research that was done, or maybe you've repeated yourself, that's really valuable to them. So it's really just kind of been ear to the ground, getting a lot of feedback. We used to do a lot of what we called learning from client phone calls. So 2 weeks after a project was finished, I would say to my team, get on the phone, call them and ask them what was good, what was bad, what was missing. We learned a lot through that process. I wish we would do that. We don't do that as often nowadays. I wish we did, because I think that it's just like, there's no end. As soon as you think you know your clients, you realize like there's more to know, and there's more to know, and there's more to know.
Note to Avi's team after they listen to this interview, start doing those calls again. Yeah. There's this story early in the early days of your company where you had built out this kind of semi-automated process for price quoting, and there's a little bit of a screw up. Tell us about what happened.
It's very kind of you to say little. At the time, I thought it was like, earth shattering. So at a certain point in the business, I think what I realized is that in order for this not just to become kind of like a hodgepodge service and really become something that was scalable, I would need to automate certain parts of the business. And my approach was, we're very much a human focused, and we have all of our translations are completed by people, not by machines. All the edits are done by people. And I think, we can talk about that if you want, but essentially what happened was that I realized there were certain parts like sending out price quotes where there was no added value to having a person involved. Right. And that was something I would, still to today, always think about where's the added value of having the person involved, and where's the automation come in and really help, to kind of enable the business to scale and to grow. And we were testing. So we were kind of testing out and just kind of piloting this new kind of automated pricing, that would go out with a button that would be clicked by clients to approve a quote. Somehow, some way, without getting into the boring details, we had sent out a price quote in the amount of $19,000 to a professor, at professor named Benjamin Sommer, and I'm saying his name, and you'll know why by the end of the story, because full credit goes to him. But we sent him a price quote. And somehow it got approved in our system. I don't know if it was human error, automated error. It doesn't really matter. We went ahead, we translated the book, we sent it to him, and he said, "Oh, I never approved that quote." And my heart sank. I mean, this was a $20,000 project, and it was kind of the beginning of the business. So this was one of our first books. It was like a really big. We're really proud of it. And, I was, of course, going to pay the translator. I mean, we had commissioned her to complete the work. And I was like, this is going to take me a year to climb out of this pit. Do I even want to do it? Should I just close the business? And I said to myself, you know what I got to do? I have to pick up the phone to Professor Sommer and just tell him what happened, and I don't know.
That must have taken a lot of courage to make that phone call.
In retrospect, it did, but I didn't really have a choice, right? Like, what was I going to do? Just eat it? Like, I was like, this is my Hail Mary, and maybe he'll, I don't know, stumble across, an extra, I don't know, pocket of money on his way home. Anyway, gave him a phone call. He was as kind as could be and said, listen, I get it. Like, I understand. I'll fund it. I wasn't sure about it before. I wasn't ready to, but if you've already done it, let's just go ahead and do it. Like, let's fund it and let's, go ahead with the project. And
now this is how you do all your sales, right?
Yeah, indeed. It's like, oh yeah, I didn't realize you were being charged $100,000. I'm happy to say that we have, since that date, we put in a lot of precautions to make sure that never happens again.
Yeah.
So that's no longer an issue. But really, I give him so much credit because, he could have very easily turned around and full right to say, okay, you're up the creek, good luck. But he didn't. And he's just a kind man. So, I'm thankful for that experience and to really, kind of have that. But it definitely taught me a number of lessons in terms of, client communication, double checking, making sure that everything is working right. Testing, new, when we're putting out a new, version of the software that we're working on, doing thorough testing on it, but make sure there's no bugs. So, a lot of lessons learned, but also, we're all going to screw up. I mean, that's part of when I train new employees, we always say, like, you're going to screw up, and that's all right. It's a matter of taking ownership. It's a matter of taking responsibility and learning from it. Yeah.
I know we're running a little short on time here, but a couple of final questions. One, I think it's really interesting. You've kind of, you host these live webinars that are kind of like a live podcast that are really, really kind of bring people together, academics and people that are interested in connecting with one another. Talk a little bit about how that came about and what impact that has on the business.
Yeah, for sure. So basically what I came to a realization, I started getting a lot of calls, or maybe I always got a lot of calls from researchers who would say to me, okay, let's go back to the example of the researchers got the vaccine research. So they need to publish it. That's the only way to kind of get credentials and proof of your research validity. But a lot of them struggle with that process of like, well, there are, I don't know, if folks know this, there are like tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of journals in the world. So how to find which ones are valuable, which ones aren't, where should I publish, where should I not publish? There's a whole predatory scam industry out there of like, of fake journals. Like it's a wild, wild west in many ways. So I'd get a lot of these phone calls. And what I realized is there's the researchers on the one side, right, who are like, producing and working on the work. And then on the other side, there are the publishers, and their job is to get that out there and make sure it gets to the libraries and make sure it gets to all the other researchers. And they really do a very poor job of speaking to each other. A lot of speaking past each other, a lot of, kind of not paying attention. And I'm of course speaking in very generic terms. There are wonderful people in both of these industries, but they didn't do a great job communicating. So what I decided to do was live Zoom sessions where I basically would invite, leaders in the academic publishing industry. So for example, I've had the head of NYU Press. I've had the head of Princeton University Press. I've had the head of The Conversation, which is a really interesting website, kind of a news website, which turns academic research into news. So like latest, findings that like people will really be interested about and written in a, accessible way. Really fascinating folks that have kind of come on. And what I do is I invite the audience or researchers who are like, I want to publish with Princeton. I want to publish with NYU. Like, how do I do that? And then they're hearing straight from the horse's mouth, as they say, right? Like they're really getting top line information because I'm bringing in top of the line guests, So for example, next month, I'm going to be talking with the chief editor at The Lancet, which is one of the most important medical journals in the world. And she's going to be talking about like, how do they decide what topics are important to publish, right? Which is like sort of a very basic fundamental question. It's like, how do we decide like as scientists, like what we care about in science world?
Yeah. And it's so important for researchers to understand that.
I mean, I would say it's so important for like all of us to, right? For sure, researchers, but like all of us, like, and I think that what we learned over the pandemic is that, I don't know about you, John. I know that I grew up like in my schooling, just kind of assuming that like scientific method was something that everyone just believed in, and research was fact. And I think that what I learned over the pandemic was that is very much not true for large swaths of the country in the US and also across the world. And you kind of have to, it's like more of a prove it attitude. It's like, well, you say that what you're saying is fact and you say you've done the research, but how do I know that's true? And what I think that, and that's one of the reasons also that I took on this podcasting role for the New Books Network of being the host of the Scholarly Communications podcast, is an understanding that if we don't do a better job of communicating what it is, what the hell's going on in, these universities and in these research institutes, and explain it in a way that each and every person can understand, then we run the risk of people not appreciating and understanding the value of research altogether, and the value of science. And I think that's kind of, if we did a lot of talking in this session about looking back at like in the early days, but if I'm thinking forward thinking and I'm thinking ahead, so really kind of our mission and our goal is to help researchers communicate that research in an effective way, to help universities and institutions. So that's kind of a shift from the B2C to B2B, and to try to help these institutions ask the hard questions of how do we help our scholars to really produce research, A, that's viable and strong, but B, that's communicable and that's understandable to the wider world. And that's something that is slowly but surely catching on. That's the trend, is that you need to be able to communicate what you're doing to folks who don't have a PhD. Because in the end of the day, it's John, it's you and I that are paying the taxes that are supporting the scientists. It's you and I that, are going to the hospitals, which are making decisions based on that research. So it's really, really critical. Comes down to fact and fiction, right? It's really critical that those things that we call facts, that we have a shared language in society about those things that we call facts, are actually grounded in fact, right? And are actually provable and repeatable. And those things are kind of what lie at the heart of what gets me excited, and gets me, pumped up for work every day.
I love the focus on your broader mission and the importance of it to society as a whole. I want to wrap things up. Last question. Yeah. Big fan of gratitude. If you look back on your career, your journey so far, who are the peers, the contemporaries, maybe the mentors who you would just want to shout out publicly and thank them for helping you along the way?
Yeah. So going back to the beginning of the business, there are two folks who I would say kind of inspired me just to have the guts to open a business. And I imagine, that most of the folks listening here don't have that problem. But for me, it was like, do I really want to go off on my own as opposed to getting a fixed salary? Do I really want to take that risk? So one of those individuals is a childhood friend. His name is Avi Goldberg, but I credit him in the sense of he was, an entrepreneur that I kind of looked up to in a totally different field. He does property management, but kind of took nothing and turned it into a multi-million-dollar business. And I was like, oh, like we're childhood buddies. Like if he could do it, and he's really talented, but like, all right, I could do it. Like, it's not rocket science. And then specifically, in the translation industry, another colleague and friend of mine, Sarah Dre, she was a lawyer, and was an intern at a law firm, and they kind of would dump all the translations on her because she was bilingual. And she kept on turning around and seeing how much they were charging for these things. And she's like, screw being a lawyer. I'm going to do this translation thing for lawyers and like make money off it. And that was what kind of gave me the inspiration and thought process to kind of think about, well, okay, she can do that in that field. Well, I like research. I like, I've kind of got the intellectual curiosity side to me. Maybe I could make this a go in, a different industry. So that kind of gave me that initial, boon. The last person I want to credit, and again, these are folks that are close to me in personal life, but I think like, just business-wise, my father-in-law, Anthony Fine, who's a practicing lawyer at a big firm in M&A law, but just his knowledge and savvy and knack for, just kind of business intuition, I would call it, and helping me in all sorts of moments, really just dropping everything else that he's got going on as soon as I have a call or I have a question. Despite the fact that the contracts that he's working on are worth many multiples of my business. But to have the humility to kind of turn around and be like, listen, like, I want to help you and I want to share with you, we're family, and that's where it starts. But I think just having that person to know, kind of has your back, but also can critique, and I love that. Like, not just kind of pat me on the back and say, oh yeah, you're doing great. And sometimes you need those folks in your life, you need those folks who are kind of gonna, pat you on the back. But sometimes you need those folks who are like, well, you're thinking about it this way. Have you considered this angle? And that can be really, really helpful. So yeah.
Avi, this has been great. Where can people go to learn more about you and connect with you and reach out if they have any questions?
Yeah, with pleasure. So first of all, I'm active on LinkedIn, Avi Staiman, Avi Staiman. So feel free to hit me up on LinkedIn. The company Twitter handle is @ALE Translation. So you're welcome to check in there. You're also welcome, especially the folks that are listening here. Anyone who wants to reach out, via email, you can also shoot me an email. It's Avi, that's AVI, at ACLang, which is short for academic language. So that's at ACLANG.com. So Avi at ACLang.com. And happy to communicate in any of those ways. I'll be heading off, next month to the Frankfurt Book Fair, which is the largest book fair in the world. Happens once a year in Frankfurt, Germany. If anyone, kind of is in the publishing industry and the research industry, we're kind of at that crossroads between publishing, research, language. So anyone in any of those industries, always happy to connect and, kind of network, I see it as a win-win. Feel free to reach out.
Great. Avi, thanks so much.
Yeah, brilliant. Thanks so much, John. I really appreciate you having me on.
Thank you for listening to the Smart Business Revolution podcast with John Corcoran. Find out more at smartbusinessrevolution.com. And while you're there, sign up for our email list and join the revolution. Revolution. And be listening for the next episode of the Smart Business Revolution podcast.